Have you ever wondered how Microsoft 365 apps really talk to each other behind the scenes? You're about to see the hidden system IT architects use to automate workflows and build apps nobody else can. The Microsoft Graph API is the actual control panel under the hood, and once you understand its basic building blocks, endpoints, permissions, and security, you'll realize how much more you can do with your data. Stick around as we break down what Graph really is and show how to connect the dots for your business. Why Graph API is the real power behind Microsoft 365. Let's be honest. Most people see Microsoft 365 as a collection of tools: Outlook for mail, Teams for meetings, SharePoint for files. That's how users approach it, and it's exactly how Microsoft markets it. The reality, though, is that these apps are just the surface. There's a whole wiring closet behind the scenes that connects them, and it runs through the Microsoft Graph API. If you've ever wondered why it seems like some larger organizations can seamlessly sync calendars, move files automatically, and build custom dashboards you can't get in any admin center, this is usually what's powering it. Graph API is the backbone. It sits there quietly, holding all the routes between your data, your users, and the tools they depend on. Now, if you've ever tried to move past what's built in to automate something that spans more than one department or system, you know the pain. You start by clicking around Teams or SharePoint, maybe experimenting with Power Automate. Early on, it's promising. The connector says you can grab messages from Teams and drop them into Planner, sync some files, create approvals. But it doesn't take long before you hit a hard stop. Either the connector doesn't support the action you need, or you discover that the so-called premium features are paywalled behind yet another license. Copying and pasting data between apps shouldn't be your automation strategy, but suddenly that's exactly where you land. Manual exports, CSV cleanups, one-off PowerShell scripts that break every time Microsoft updates an endpoint. And that's not even getting into situations where your organization uses tools that Microsoft just doesn't cover out of the box. Imagine a retailer with a large workforce. They want to sync work schedules from their custom HR solution into Teams and SharePoint automatically. The built-in tools balk instantly. Teams can't reach into the HR system. SharePoint won't talk to Teams without a manual handoff. And integration boils down to downloading and re-uploading spreadsheets. At some point during that back and forth, the IT team realizes they're spending more time updating files than actually managing their business. This is where Graph flips the script. When you need to sync user profiles, update group memberships, pull calendar events straight from the source, or even kick off multi-app workflows from a single action, Graph API becomes the single gateway. It isn't just for developers either. Anyone willing to learn a few basics can get as much power out of it as someone who's been coding for years. What makes it different is not just how much data it provides, but what you can do after getting your hands on it. Let's say you need an automated report of all Teams meetings and shared documents for compliance every quarter. With standard tools, this turns into a month-long project of exporting logs, mapping users, and stitching it all together by hand. When you use Graph, it's a handful of well-crafted queries and a script to format your report. You need to automate onboarding for new employees. Instead of bouncing between admin centers to create accounts, assign licenses, and share OneDrive folders, Graph can bundle it into a single repeatable workflow. That time savings translates into fewer mistakes, faster ramps, and maybe best of all, less frustration with brittle or incomplete connectors. But most admins and even a lot of IT pros never see this wiring closet. Microsoft doesn't exactly highlight it on the front page. It's invisible. You're not going to find a shiny button labeled Graph API in Teams or Outlook settings. Yet underneath every magic integration, anytime a custom dashboard updates instantly or HR data pushes into user profiles, Graph is almost always the patch cable connecting the systems. Those who know it exists get to break out of the constraints forced by official connectors and prepackaged solutions. Everyone else just keeps waiting for Microsoft to release the next update and hoping it finally solves their problem. The catch is unlocking this control panel has a learning curve. The biggest sticking point usually hits right after someone discovers Graph, even before their first automation. It's all about security and access. You get a glimpse of what's possible, but then Azure AD pops up a wall of consent requests, tokens, and error messages. Do you want to give this app access to user data? Suddenly everyone backs away. No one wants to be the admin who broke permissions and exposed sensitive data, or the one left stuck in approval loops every time an app needs just one more permission. Still, once you realize that Graph is this central wiring space and that you're not locked out of it forever, a lot of options start to open up. People who understand how it plugs into Teams, Outlook, SharePoint, and more can build integrations and automations that Microsoft hasn't even shipped yet. The first step is seeing that the control panel is there, sitting under the surface. Of course, seeing the wiring is one thing. Learning how to get keys to the cabinet without setting off alarms is the next challenge. And honestly, that's where most people either stall out or get it wrong. Getting in securely and reliably is its own art form. And that's what we're about to tackle, how you unlock this power without bringing the whole tenant down or leaving gaps attackers can slip through. Cracking the safe, authentication and permissions demystified. Finding the wiring closet is one thing. Cracking it open without breaking anything is another. This is the moment when almost everyone runs into that big lock on the door. Authentication and permissions. We're talking about the security that shields everything behind Graph API, and let's be honest, it's where confidence levels suddenly drop. Even experienced admins who've spent years in Azure AD or wrestling with Exchange Online tense up the first time they see the full flow. Auth 2.0 consent prompts unfamiliar terms like scopes, tokens, and redirects. It reads like a legal contract tied up with technical jargon, and all you wanted was to automate a calendar sync. Why does this step feel so intimidating? Well, most dashboards just give you toggles, but Graph asks you to define what your app or automation needs to touch in a world where everything is locked down by default. If you think about how easy it is to give away the keys by mistake, it's no wonder many give up or over-permission their apps just to make it work. That approach leads to its own set of disasters. I've seen so many environments where a quick and dirty fix turns into a security hole because read all mailboxes was the easy way out. Never mind that the automation only needed access to user display names. The reality for IT pros is you're always walking a line. You want enough power to get the data and take action, but not so much that you end up blowing open the safe and inviting risk. And here's where a lot of people get stuck, the approval process. Maybe you're following best practices, requesting the fewest permissions. Suddenly, nothing runs until your request wades through a swamp of admin pop-ups, warning banners, and mysterious error codes. Case in point, an IT manager I worked with spent 3 days trying to automate group membership updates, only to get blocked. Every attempt triggered a different error message: admin consent required, invalid scope, token expired. Meanwhile, leadership just wanted results, not another reason that the project slipped its deadline. Let's slow it down for a second. When you set up an app with Graph, here's what actually happens behind the scenes. Azure Active Directory is that skeptical security guard checking IDs at the door. When your workflow or app wants in, it knocks on the Azure AD door, presenting its credentials and requesting specific scopes. Scopes are exactly what they sound like, lists of what your app is allowed to do and nothing more. Think read user profile, update calendar, or send mail as user. If Azure AD agrees you've been granted those rights, it hands over what's called an OAuth 2.0 token. This token is a stamped pass listing exactly what your workflow can access. Hand it to Graph, and Graph will only let you access the pieces checked off by your token. Anything else gets denied, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a blunt error message. Tokens have limits, though. They expire just like a visitor's badge, sometimes in an hour, sometimes even sooner. This design is intentional. It forces frequent check-ins with Azure AD, reducing the risk that a lost or leaked token turns into trouble down the line. And scopes, as simple as they sound, are mapped to the endpoints you interact with. If you want user profile info, but request access to read all files, Azure AD pushes back. It's not just about security. This structure keeps your automations neat and avoids sprawling permissions that gradually turn into maintenance nightmares. Graph's fine-grained permissions are where things get interesting. You don't actually need to open the whole safe to get what you want. You can be surgical. Just the user's phone number, not their mailbox. Just calendar events for a specific group, not the company-wide mail flow. But you have to know how to ask, and honestly, most of us only learn the hard way. Permissions are split into delegated runs as a user needs their sign-in. An application run quietly in the background, service to service. There's a lot less hand-holding here compared to older APIs or admin portals. The most practical advice I give every time, start with the bare minimum, least privilege possible. If something fails, look at the error, read the exact permission missing, and only then request it. This slows things down at first, but pays off tenfold when auditors come knocking or a user asks why your reporting script can see files it shouldn't. Remember, over-permissioning your app is almost always faster, but it creates future headaches most teams would rather avoid. To help make sense of all this, picture a tokens journey. Your app sends a request to Azure AD with its own ID and the scopes it needs. Azure AD evaluates, checks if a human or admin already consented, and if so, sends back a signed token. You hand this token straight to Graph as proof, like flashing that badge at a guarded door. Each hop checks for the right credentials and permission. Only if everything matches do you get data back, and even then, only what you asked for. Mastering this process means you get real control, not by luck, but by precision. You can build safer automations, let the right people approve only what's needed, and keep auditors happy. And right after you figure this out, something shifts. The intimidating part fades, replaced by possibility. You finally have real keys to the wiring closet. The next question is, how do you use those keys to pull out business data and automate the drudge work for good? Let's see what a real-life Graph API call feels like. Your first real query, turning endpoints into actions. Getting through authentication feels like a mountain, but moving from theory into your first real call is where you actually see why anyone bothers with Graph API in the first place. Most people expect to run a simple request, but then they open the documentation and it's like staring at a subway map with 100 crisscrossing lines. You see endpoints like users or groups, but nobody says upfront how to narrow this down or why your request keeps failing with arcane error codes. The documentation says just hit users, and suddenly you're looking at a dump of every user in the entire tenant, unless you make the classic rookie mistake and ask for way too much, in which case Graph quietly chokes or dumps a 400 back at you. Let's say you're that business analyst who needs a daily report of newly created users. Out of the box, there's no simple button for that, so you burn hours a week dumping CSVs, combing through columns, and hoping you caught every new joiner. This is where Graph flips the workload. Instead of trickling through admin screens, you can hit the user's endpoint, bolt on a query filter, and get only the people added in the past day. Something like users filtered created date time, G 2024-04-01T-0000Z. Now, what used to be tedious manual tracking comes back as a tight report you can automate, parse, and chart however you want. Of course, getting that magic query right is the sticking point. You have to know exactly which endpoint corresponds to your data. Users gets you everyone. Me is strictly about the currently authenticated user. So groups brings back group objects, and every endpoint expects certain permissions that you need to have sorted out. Let's not gloss over the role of query parameters here. These little bits let you slice and dice the results. You might just want email and department, not the full user block. Drop in select to pick only what you need, or top to keep the results set manageable. Otherwise, you risk overfetching and hitting response limits. Graph won't hesitate to cut you off at 100 results if you get greedy. For filtering, filter is flexible but picky. If your syntax is off, expect a quiet failure or a cryptic error that doesn't even mention where you went wrong. Another real-world snag, what you can fetch and filter depends on your permissions and the endpoints themselves. Some properties can be filtered server-side, others can't. Until you see a query fail or succeed, it's hard to know what's possible. That's why most pros use Graph Explorer or Postman for their first round of experiments. In Graph Explorer, which is Microsoft's own web tool, you log in and can play around with calls without breaking live automations. As you build up confidence, you move to PowerShell scripts or API calls from your workflow platform. The advantage with Graph Explorer isn't just testing syntax. It actually tells you which permissions you're missing or need to consent to, saving a lot of trial and error down the line. A simple GET request is the entry point for most business users. PowerShell fans might use invoke REST method to call the API, supplying their token and a tidy URL. In Postman, you paste your endpoint, drop in the bearer token, and hit send. Results arrive in a familiar JSON block. This is where the whole thing clicks. You aren't just poking at documentation, you see actual business data flow back on your terms. You can parse, format, turn it into reports, or feed it straight into a downstream process. That's where Graph starts to feel less like a mystery and more like an actual control panel for your tenant. But it's not just about pulling data once. You'll want to handle errors cleanly, especially as you scale up. Throttling is real. Microsoft imposes rate limits, and if you blow past them, you'll get back a 429 error. The fix is usually to pause and retry, but that means you need to think about error handling even on your earliest scripts. 401 and 403 codes are also part of the game. One means your token expired, the other that you're asking for something you don't have permission to see. Over time, you build a habit of reading responses closely, adjusting your calls, and not just blindly copying sample code. Best practice for anyone getting started. Use Graph Explorer as a playground. Test everything there first, get your permissions straight, see what data comes back. Only after it works in Explorer should you move that logic into a scheduled workflow or app. This habit will save hours of frustration and a lot of broken scripts. That first working API call is a legit light bulb moment. You see something returned that nobody else can pull, built exactly for your needs. After that, it stops being about endpoints and starts being about solutions. What can you automate next? How can you connect this to Power Automate or build reporting that would never be possible with off-the-shelf dashboards? And the real fun comes when you begin chaining these calls, because that's when Graph moves from a handy tool to something that can truly reshape your business processes. From simple queries to business-grade apps, connecting the building blocks. So, you've gotten a few simple Graph API queries under your belt. Maybe you're fetching user accounts by date or pulling group info for a dashboard. It's a win, but if you stop there, you're leaving 90% of the value on the table. The real shift happens when you start combining those building blocks into automation, reporting, and even custom apps that actually fit the way your business runs. Most teams only automate a spreadsheet dump. They call it a day and move on. What's lost in that approach is just how far you can go. Calendars, files, meetings, group management, even tying in logic from Power Platform or apps outside Microsoft 365 entirely. If you can describe it, you can probably piece it together. Think about it. You've got one endpoint showing you new users, another exposing group membership, and a third that lets you create or update resources across the tenant. When you run these queries separately, they're useful, but chained together, they cut out entire chunks of busy work. Take a scenario from a healthcare provider, not theory, but real life. They had to onboard dozens of new staff every week, a process that should have been routine, but was anything but. Before Graph, it was an ugly cocktail of manual account creation, guessing which groups a new user needed, and then hoping someone remembered to provision OneDrive. Miss a step, and employees either can't access sensitive records or worse, have access they shouldn't. With a bit of architecture, they linked three basic kinds of graph calls: create the user, assign them to security or distribution groups, then provision their OneDrive with starter content. Instead of passing account details through 6 different admin panels, the team bundled the process into a single flow. The automation didn't just save time, it slashed errors and reduced all those "why can't I log in" tickets. This isn't out of reach. The same endpoints you've been testing are the backbone here. The next level is where things start scaling fast and you hit a few new snags. Once you automate more than a simple report, challenges surface. Your code base sprawls, rate limits emerge, and every change in business logic threatens to break permissions somewhere down the chain. What started as a collection of scripts now needs to be organized. Think modules, functions, and naming patterns that make sense to someone else in your team 6 months from now. Reduce the urge to hardcode anything sensitive, store secrets in Azure Key Vault or an equivalent tool, then reference them securely in your scripts. You want auditable, repeatable automations, not magic code only you understand. Handling rate limit errors isn't glamorous, but it's necessary. Microsoft Graph is built to protect itself from overload. Once you cross a certain threshold, you'll get throttled with 429 responses. Instead of failing, add retry logic that respects the retry after header and back off. The best solutions might even queue jobs if they sense throttling, so nothing valuable gets lost because you pulled too much at once. Permissions too need attention. As your solution grows, those let everything through early choices start looking risky. Schedule periodic reviews of what each app or script can access and adjust as rules or requirements change. Choosing the right tools for building quickly comes down to your goals. Microsoft ships SDKs for .NET, JavaScript, and Python. These aren't just wrappers. They take care of token management, response parsing, error checking, and even pagination, letting you focus on business logic instead of HTTP details. If you have a team that's fluent in C or Node, JS, spin up a project with the official SDK. For more business user scenarios, Power Automate and Logic apps let you chain graph actions visually. You gain less low-level control, but get simple drag and drop workflows, and built-in integration with hundreds of other services. Use these when you need speed and broad coverage, not deep customization. All the while, prototyping in Graph Explorer remains one of the lowest friction ways to test ideas. You get to see responses, tweak endpoints, and sort out permissions long before you touch production data. Once a workflow is solid, port that query or logic into your production code base. Logging becomes critical as you scale. Capture not just critical errors, but also warnings about near misses, failed requests, or permission denials. Over time, you'll notice recurring patterns and edge cases which inform the next round of improvements. Monitoring comes next. Set up alerting for failed automation runs, dropped API calls, or repeated throttle incidents. It's better to get a nudge that something isn't working than to find out 3 weeks after a report stopped updating. Advanced users will leverage batch requests and Delta queries. Batch lets you combine multiple operations, reducing the chance of hitting limits. Delta queries help you fetch only what's changed, which keeps things fast and lean, even as your organization grows. None of this works without maintenance. Rotate app secrets on a regular schedule, not just when you remember. Old secrets are a favorite entry point for attackers and rarely get cleaned up. Make a habit of revisiting permissions so your apps don't blindside you months later. All these steps turn what started as basic scripts into reliable ops tooling or even business-grade apps. Once you start assembling Graph's building blocks, layering secure authentication, tight endpoints, and the right development tools, you're building solutions tailored to your reality, not just what Microsoft hopes you need. And suddenly those months-long waits for an official connector are irrelevant. The only real question left is what you'll automate first, and who will be surprised when the impossible integration finally just works. If you've ever felt boxed in by what Microsoft 365 lets you automate out of the box, knowing how Graph API works changes everything. Suddenly you see that control panel buried under layers of dashboards. Now, all those endpoints and permissions aren't just buzzwords, they're practical tools. This is how you move beyond what's available in admin centers and start shaping Microsoft 365 around your business instead of the other way around. If you plan to avoid endless manual work and future-proof your setup, Learning Graph is simply the next step.